Okay, hello again guys and welcome to lesson 11 of GCSE Geography. It's lesson 11 of theme 5, Weather, Climate and Ecosystems. Today we're going to be looking at food chains and food webs. So that involves developing the concept that food chains it's all about the flow of energy. Why do we eat things? It's to get energy for cell repair, for growth and so forth. We're then also going to use that knowledge to construct our own rainforest food web, and we're going to interpret and explain how human activity can impact on the rainforest food web. So if you go ahead and pause the video here for a moment and just write this title down in your books, please. Okay, so let's just warm up our brains a little bit and activate our prior knowledge from last lesson. So we're going to do something called if this is the answer, what was the question? So for example, what is the capital of England? London is the answer. What is the capital of England is the question. So you're kind of thinking of it in reverse. If I said to you the answer to the question is Cardiff, the question would have been, what is the capital of Wales? Okay, so that's the concept of this warm-up game. So if the answer is biomass, what could the question possibly have been? Don't worry about writing anything down. This is just a little thinking in our minds. What possible questions could there have been if this was the answer? Okay, so last lesson we learned that biomass is the key term for the store of living nutrients, or the living store of nutrients made up from living things in the nutrient cycle. It's also the largest nutrient store in the rainforest, but not in deciduous woodlands in Britain, because the trees lose their leaves in Britain, whereas in rainforests they hold on to their leaves, they retain their leaves, and therefore the nutrients remain for longer in the biomass, so the store is larger. Okay, next one. If the answer to a question is abiotic, what might the question have been? Okay, we learnt last lesson that abiotic is the key term for the non-living elements in an ecosystem. Biotic is the living things, abiotic is non-living. What might the question have been if the answer was saprophytes? Okay, perhaps it was the key term for the plants and fungus that decompose dead matter in the litter store. You've got detritivores as well, which is the animal elements of the decomposers, the woodlice, the worms and things like that. So saprophytes and detritivores are your decomposers. They are an essential element of the nutrient cycle. Without them, the nutrients wouldn't be replaced back into the soil, because these are the guys that rot down the dead stuff in the litter store to replace the nutrients in the soil. Okay, last one. If the answer is because the trees are deciduous, so they lose their leaves, what might the question have been? I haven't made this one particularly easy, to be fair. So possible questions, it could have been, why is the litter store larger in British woodlands than in rainforests? Or why is the biomass store smaller in British woodlands than in forests? And it's all to do with the fact that the trees lose their leaves, which means they lose nutrients from the biomass, and those nutrients go to the litter store. It was all in the last explanation elements that we did, comparing the two nutrient cycles in the British woodland and in the rainforest. So we're going to get going today with what we're looking at with regards to food chains and webs. So this is the definition of a food chain. It shows the movement of energy through an ecosystem, such as a rainforest. So if you just pause the video here a moment and write down this definition in your books. Okay, so here's a visual example of a food chain. All right, so the energy is moved through an ecosystem by one thing eating another. It's a single chain of consumption. So at the start of this chain, you have a producer. Now, the producer is always a plant. Why do you think a food chain always starts with a plant? In this case, it's an oak tree. It could be grass. It could be a flower or any sort of plant. Why are they always the start of a food chain? It's because they technically don't need to eat anything as such. Now, before you go, what about Venus flytraps? Because somebody always says that. But on the whole, producers, plants, they don't actually eat anything. They absorb nutrients from the soil and they absorb energy from the sunlight using chlorophyll, chloroplasts, photosynthesis. So they get their food using energy from the sun and they produce their own food. Hence, they're known as producers. All right. So you've always got a plant at the beginning of your food chain. Now, whatever eats the plant, the first thing, the primary thing in the chain, another word for eating or using is to consume. Another word for first is primary. So you've got your primary consumer. Now, they are usually, but not always, a herbivore. Herbivores eat plants only. In some cases, it may be an omnivore. Perhaps they eat maybe ants or bugs or something as well. Omnivore means they eat both vegetation and meat. You've got your primary consumer, in this case a caterpillar. Then you've got your secondary consumer, in this case a blue tit, and then your tertiary consumer, in this case a hawk. So your end link in the chain, if there's nothing eating it, that's your top predator. In some instances, the chain may stop shorter. If there's nothing eating the secondary consumer, then even though it's only the secondary consumer, that could also be a top predator. In some cases, there may be something even further. You might have a quaternary consumer that would then be your top predator. All right, but I've just done a really simple example here. Now, the key thing to notice is the direction of the arrows. This quite often causes some confusion because in your minds you think, well, the caterpillar is eating the tree. So the arrow goes from the caterpillar to the tree. No, it doesn't. Okay, the way that I remember it is this is going into the belly of the caterpillar. It's giving energy to the caterpillar. And then the caterpillar gets eaten by the blue tit. It goes into its belly. All right, so the arrow goes towards the thing that's doing the eating. It shows the flow of energy to the thing that is consuming. All right, so just always remember that. So pause the video here a moment, put a subheading food chains. You can put that black sentence if you like, the energy is moved through an ecosystem, but it's very similar to the definition you've just written. So you could leave that out if you wish, but then just make a very simple copy of this food chain. If drawing isn't your strength, don't stress and try to draw a blue tit and a hawk and what have you. Just write the blue words instead of doing the drawings. But definitely write down all the red, all the blue, and all the green arrows. The drawings are optional. So pause the video here and just make your book look like this slide, basically. As big or small as you like, whatever takes your fancy. Okay, so sometimes, a food chain is just a singular sequence, one thing eating another. But there may be instances where more than one thing eats this caterpillar, for example. So you'd have another secondary consumer coming off here, maybe another secondary consumer coming off here. There might be something else as well as the hawk that eats the blue tit. So you might have another tertiary consumer coming off here, and food chains start to overlap and interlink. And that's what creates a food web. Okay, so here's an example that I found on the internet of a rainforest food web. So you've got your producers at the bottom here, and you'll notice again, orchids, that's a flower, different seeds, trees down here, and bamboo. These are all producers. They make their energy from the sun through photosynthesis. They don't need to consume anything themselves. You've then got a row of primary consumers. So all of these things eat the producers. All of these things eat the primary consumers. And these things eat. Now you'll notice there's more than one arrow going into some of these tertiary consumers. So they eat more than one thing. So in the case of the python, they eat a couple of different primary consumers. In the case of the jaguar, He eats a couple of different primary consumers, but also a frog, a secondary consumer. So the reason these are arranged in levels, this may have an overlap with science. I don't know if you've come across it in biology yet. It's called trophic levels. I don't remember very much from my A-level biology, but it's to do with just the stages of energy and the number of organisms that you get at each trophic level at each stage. Okay, so we're going to create our own food web now, and we're going to lay it out in a similar way. We're going to keep it in levels, so producers at the bottom, primary, secondary, tertiary, and then we're going to add the arrows on. Now you've got a sheet accompanying this lesson that has lots of different rainforest animals on it, and underneath each animal or plant it tells you whether they are a primary, secondary, tertiary consumer or a producer, and it also tells you what they eat. Okay, so if you read that information, you should be able to work out where to stick them and where the arrows go to create your own rainforest food web. Now I do recommend you take pretty much a whole portrait layout page to do this, because you need quite a bit of space. Remember, important, the arrow direction goes from the food towards the thing that's eating it. It goes into the belly of the thing that's doing the eating. Now to help you visualize what I mean, okay, I've made a little layout for you. So your producer will be at the bottom. Now in your sheet that I've given you, there's only one producer, okay? There are 3 primary consumers, there are 2 secondary consumers, and there are 2 tertiary consumers, and 1 quaternary consumer, your top predator. Okay, so it's up of your 3 primary consumers. It doesn't matter which way round you put the 3 within the same trophic level. Okay, same with your secondary, they can go either way round, and your tertiary. When it comes to then working out your arrows, remember, it goes from the thing that's being eaten into the belly of the thing that's doing the eating. And remember, in some cases, with the jaguar, for example, which is the top predator, they eat more than one thing. If you read the card, I can't remember what it tells you. If they eat quolls and monkeys, I can't remember what it was, but just as an example, then you'll have 2 arrows, okay, going from the monkey into the jaguar's belly and going from the quoll, the spotted quoll, into the jaguar's belly. Okay, so pause the video here a moment, get your cutting and sticking game on, read the information on the little cutout cards, and it should be able to fall into place then what animal goes where and where the arrows go. Okay, so pause the video here and give that a try. Okay, so if it's come together just about right, then this is where your animals go. Now remember, you might have monkey, dove, beetle. You might have beetle, monkey, dove. It doesn't matter which way round they go in the levels, as long as they're in the correct level. Okay, now your arrows, the producer down here, I've still got producer written in there, I should say fig tree. Okay, so you've got your fig tree down here. Your primary consumers all eat figs. All right, they love the fruit, the figs that grow on the fig trees. Your secondary consumers, pitters, like to eat beetles, and tarantulas like to eat doves. Spotted quolls, they eat beetles and pitter birds, given half the chance they can catch one. The pythons, they will eat pitter birds and doves. And jaguars, as we discussed earlier, they eat monkeys and quolls if they can catch them. So your food webs should look something like this, but don't stress if it's not exactly the same layout, because you might have put things in different orders slightly, so therefore your arrows will be in slightly different places to mine. But here's just a visualization of roughly what it should look like. Okay. So what we're going to discuss now, as always, is basically when humans come along, how are they interacting and imbalancing the food web? So for example, first of all, say hunters are coming along and they are overhunting jaguars, trophy hunting. Okay, this is still a thing. It still goes on. People do still hang the pelts, the furs on their wall or as rugs and so on. So imagine jaguars get pretty much wiped out. So there are now no top predators. Anything that jaguar eats, what will happen to their numbers now that there's no jaguars around to eat them? Yeah, if they don't have a predator anymore, then their numbers are going to go up. But instead of saying their numbers will go up, it's better vocabulary, their population will increase. Okay? So for example, in this case, if the jaguars are hunted by humans, the quoll population would increase and the monkey population would increase because they have lost their predator. As a result, if there are now more quolls, this could mean what? If the quoll population increases, more quolls would maybe mean the beetle population would decline and the pitta population would decline because there are more quolls eating them. Okay? Now you could carry on going and you could say if there are now fewer beetles because there's more quolls eating them, then the beetles won't be eating the figs, so there's more figs for the monkeys and the doves to eat, so their population numbers would increase, and if there's more doves, then there'd be more food for the pythons, so their population would increase. You could go on forever and ever because the nature of a food web is it is exactly that. It's all interlinked. It's a web. But if you get an exam question about a food web, it'll normally be around about the 4 mark limit. Okay, so I'd say 3 steps maximum. Do not say something like this. If there were less jaguars, there would be less quolls and less monkeys, which means more pittas and more beetles. You won't get more than 1 out of 4 for that. It's far too basic. What you haven't done there is said why there would be more quolls and more monkeys and why there would be more beetles. Okay, so a better way to word it, if the jaguar population declined due to hunting, then the quoll population and monkey population would increase because they now have fewer predators. As a result of an increase in quoll population, there would be fewer beetles and fewer pittas because there's now more quolls eating them. Yeah? You could also say if the monkey population increases, there'd be fewer figs because there's more monkeys eating them, and this would mean less food for the beetles and doves, so their populations may decline. Whatever route you decide to take, 3 steps max, and use your explaining words. Why would the population increase or why would the population decrease? Okay, so with that in mind, here's 3 questions. Okay, we've just discussed the first one. The second one, this is becoming more and more common with deforestation being an issue in the rainforest. You've got outsiders coming in, setting up huge commercial logging companies. A commercial logging company, commercial means big business, trading, selling. So you've got outside companies that are maybe run by international corporations, therefore the people working for them coming into the rainforest are not local, and they're bringing in illnesses, something as simple as the common cold, which we are all immune to, we get it each year. The tribes in the rainforest, the animals and the plants in the rainforest have never seen that virus, and it will kill them. So imagine in number 2, a disease brought in by outsiders. Well, I should say outsiders, not outside. Oh no, a disease brought in by outside contamination wipes out a large percentage of the fig beetle population. So imagine fig beetles plummet to almost 0. How will this affect the food web? Remember 3 steps and explain them. Now lastly, this is activating some prior knowledge. Number 1 and 2 are talking about the local impact of humans on the food web. What would happen to the food web just in the rainforest? Number 3 is linking the impact of human activity to a global scale. It's asking you, if the trees were cut down, how does this affect the climate and the nutrient cycle? Now for 3A, what do trees give off? Yes, they release oxygen and they take in carbon dioxide for us. They're a carbon sink. But what else do they release? We talked about this way back when we did the water cycle. It begins with T. Trees release transpiration. That's moisture into the air. So if you've cut down the trees, there's no transpiration, which means less moisture in the air. Therefore, fewer clouds will form. As a result, precipitation levels will drop, and long term, the climate in that area will dry out. And if the climate dries out, any remaining rainforest will die. We call this a tipping point, a point past which we can't reverse the damage we've caused. The rest of the rainforest will die even if we stop deforestation because we've altered the climate to such a degree that we can't reverse it. So a question like this, use your explaining words. The climate would dry out because no trees means no transpiration, therefore less moisture in the air. As a result, fewer clouds will form. therefore less precipitation will fall. The nutrient cycle, this is more recent in your memory, we only looked at this last lesson. So you remove the trees, you've got no biomass. Again, use your explaining words. If there's no biomass, how would that affect the nutrient cycle? Pause the video here a moment and give this a go. I'm expecting probably at least maybe 4 or 5 lines for each of these, certainly for 1 and 2. If you want to copy the question and write a slightly shorter answer, that's your call. If you'd rather just go straight in with a full sentence, that's also fine. Whichever way you do it, it needs to make sense when you revise from it, but it's entirely your choice. So pause the video here a moment and give that a go. Okay, so on the next slide, I have actually given you some model answers. So please be strict with yourself and try and make sure that you've given it a go first. And what I'd like you then to do is self-assess against my model answers. What could you have added, or how could you have changed the structure or level of explanation and elaboration that you've given to make sure that certainly 1 and 2 could be worth up to 4 marks. I'd say maybe the same for 3A. Probably there'd be a 3 marker and 3B a 3 marker itself as well. So number 1, written in red, is pretty much exactly what I sort of said when we were still on the food web slide. Number 2, if the beetles are wiped out, the fig tree has lost one of its predators, which means there will be more figs for the monkeys and doves, so their population would increase. This could then cause an increase in jaguar populations as their food source, brackets monkeys, has also increased. Now, you may have gone a different route. Okay, that's not the only correct answer, but what I want you to look at is the structure. You might have gone a different pathway into different specific animals that were impacted, but that's the kind of structure and level of explanation and elaboration that we'd be looking for. And then the same in 3A and B. Okay, 3A is pretty much what I ran through, and 3B, if you've cut down the biomass, no trees means no fallen branches or leaves. There's nothing being added to the litter store. If there's no litter, there's nothing to decompose to put nutrients back into the soil. And if there's no nutrients in the soil, nothing can regrow. So again, even if we went back to an area and tried to implement an afforestation scheme, a planting tree scheme to replace the rainforest that's been lost, if there's no nutrients in the soil, it won't work. Those kind of repair projects will fail, and there's no way that, I mean, a cattle ranch is like 70,000 hectares. That's a small one. There's no way you can use fertilizer across an area of that scale. So you can see why we're concerned about human activity in the rainforest, because if we're not careful, some of the damage we're causing is potentially irreversible. So on that happy note, that's the end of lesson 11. Well done. Next lesson, I think we are actually moving on to rainforests specifically. So we've got the background of what is an ecosystem, how are nutrients cycled in an ecosystem, what eats what, and how does energy get transferred through an ecosystem. So now we're going to focus on specific ecosystem examples. We're going to look at rainforests first, then we're going to look at African savanna grasslands, and then we're going to look at British hedgerows, and we're going to compare and contrast all three, because obviously they're very different in terms of their climate, in terms of their flora, the plants that grow there, their fauna, the animals that live there, and their scale as well. Obviously rainforests and African savanna grasslands are on a far bigger scale than British hedgerows are. All right, so well done for today. Rainforests up next.